"I'm your boss," the black waitress said quietly. And for one long second, the executive boardroom forgot how to breathe before laughter burst across the polished walnut table like it had been waiting for permission. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, the billionaire CEO wearing the effortless grin of a man who believed every room belonged to him. His laughter was measured at first, then louder, joined by a few senior executives who exchanged amused glances as crystal water glasses trembled against expensive coasters. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun, its skyline reflecting off neighboring towers like monuments built for people exactly like Ethan. Inside the headquarters of Caldwell Dynamics, everything whispered power. Italian marble floors stretched beneath tailored shoes worth more than most families spent on rent in a month. Original artwork lined the walls. Awards filled illuminated shelves. Every polished surface reminded visitors that billion-dollar decisions were made here every single day. And standing quietly beside the conference table, holding nothing more than a silver coffee tray, was Naomi Brooks, a black waitress almost no one had noticed until she spoke 6 impossible words. "Did you hear that?" one vice president muttered with a smirk. "She actually thinks she's the boss." Another executive chuckled into his coffee. Someone farther down the table shook his head and whispered, "This has to be some kind of joke." Ethan rested both hands on the conference table and looked directly at Naomi for the first time all afternoon. It wasn't the glance someone gives another professional. It was the distracted look reserved for background staff who accidentally interrupt important conversations. "Young lady," he said with practiced confidence, "I admire your sense of humor, but this meeting is reserved for executives." Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as though she had expected every laugh before entering the room. Around her, the soft hum of the building's climate system blended with the distant sound of elevators carrying employees between 43 floors of ambition. Somewhere outside the conference room, phones rang, keyboards clicked, and another multi-million-dollar deal was probably being negotiated. Yet inside this room, time slowed. Ethan noticed her composure, but dismissed it. Confidence meant nothing without authority. At least, that was what he had believed his entire career. "Security can help you find your manager," he added, smiling politely enough to disguise the insult. More laughter followed. One director even reached for his phone beneath the table, already imagining the story he would tell over dinner. Naomi simply looked toward the massive oak doors at the far end of the room. She wasn't looking at Ethan anymore. She was waiting, calmly, patiently, as though the next person to walk through those doors mattered infinitely more than the loudest man already sitting inside. The laughter lingered longer than it should have, bouncing off the glass walls before dissolving into the quiet confidence that always surrounded powerful people who believed they could never be surprised. Ethan Caldwell folded his hands and glanced toward the digital display, showing quarterly revenue projections climbing higher than analysts had predicted. In his mind, the meeting had already returned to business. Naomi Brooks was simply an interruption that would disappear the moment security arrived. Yet she remained exactly where she stood, her silver coffee tray resting comfortably against one hand, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on the closed doors across the room instead of the billionaire who expected everyone to look at him. That alone unsettled a few people around the table. Most employees became nervous under Ethan's attention. Naomi seemed untouched by it. Daniel Ross, the chief operating officer, leaned toward another executive and whispered, "Has anyone seen her before?" The reply came with a shrug. "Probably catering. They rotate staff all the time." Margaret Sullivan, one of the longest-serving board members, quietly watched Naomi without joining the laughter. She had attended hundreds of meetings inside this room, and experience had taught her that truly confident people rarely felt the need to prove themselves. The silence surrounding Naomi felt different. It carried purpose. Ethan finally pushed his chair back and stood, adjusting the sleeves of his custom navy suit. Every movement reflected years of commanding investors, negotiating acquisitions, and standing before financial reporters. "This company employs nearly 12,000 people," he said evenly. "Respect for professional boundaries is one reason we became an industry leader." Several executives nodded in agreement. Naomi listened without interrupting. Her expression never changed. She neither accepted the criticism nor challenged it. She simply waited. Outside the conference room, assistants hurried through the executive hallway carrying tablets, presentation folders, and steaming cups of coffee. The headquarters never truly slowed down. Every minute represented another opportunity, another negotiation, another decision affecting billions of dollars in market value. Inside the boardroom, however, every second suddenly felt unusually heavy. Daniel glanced toward the clock mounted above the entrance. "The chairman is late," he murmured. Margaret looked at the same clock before quietly replying, "He is rarely late without a reason." Ethan heard the exchange, but dismissed it. "We will begin without him if necessary," he announced. "Our agenda cannot wait." Just as he reached for the presentation remote, a soft electronic tone echoed through the room. The secure elevator assigned exclusively to board members had arrived on the executive floor. Every conversation stopped. Even the air seemed to grow still. Naomi finally shifted her gaze from the doors to the executives surrounding the table. It was not a victorious look. It was almost compassionate, as though she understood that within the next few minutes every assumption in the room would be tested. The polished oak doors remained closed for one final heartbeat. Then the handle slowly turned. The polished doors opened without a sound, and every conversation vanished before a single word was spoken. William Harrison entered first, moving with the calm confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades leading boardrooms where fortunes changed with a signature instead of a speech. His silver hair, charcoal suit, and measured stride commanded more attention than any raised voice ever could. Beside him walked 2 additional board members carrying slim black folders sealed with the company crest. No one smiled. No one greeted Ethan. The atmosphere shifted so quickly that even the city skyline beyond the windows seemed to fade into the background. Ethan straightened instinctively before offering a practiced smile. "William, we were just about to begin." The chairman acknowledged him with a brief nod, but continued walking until he reached the head of the conference table. Instead of taking his usual seat immediately, he carefully placed the sealed folder in front of him and looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with every executive before his gaze finally rested on Naomi Brooks. The corners of his mouth softened into the faintest expression of recognition. It lasted only a second, but Margaret Sullivan noticed it. So did Daniel Ross. Ethan did not. He was too focused on recovering control of the meeting. "Before we move to today's agenda," Ethan said, forcing an easy laugh, "we have had an unexpected interruption from a member of the hospitality staff." Several executives chuckled again, though the laughter sounded noticeably weaker than before. William Harrison remained completely still. "An interruption?" he repeated quietly. "That is one way to describe it." The room fell silent once more. Naomi had not moved from her place beside the conference table. She still held the silver tray with both hands, as though nothing unusual had happened. To everyone else, she looked exactly like the same waitress who had quietly poured coffee only minutes earlier. Yet William regarded her with unmistakable respect, something usually reserved for leaders who had earned it over many years. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair. He had attended enough board meetings to recognize subtle signals, and this was one of them. Something important had already been decided before anyone entered this room. Ethan finally noticed the unusual mood. "Security should be here shortly," he said, glancing toward the hallway. "There is no reason to delay business." William slowly removed his glasses and folded them neatly on the table. "There will be no need for security, Ethan." The words were calm, but they carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Every executive exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." William rested one hand on the sealed folder without opening it. "You will." His voice remained steady. "But before this meeting continues, there is someone in this room every director should properly recognize." Naomi lowered the coffee tray onto a nearby service cart with quiet precision. For the first time that afternoon, she stepped away from the wall and toward the conference table. No one laughed. No one whispered. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier had been replaced by curiosity, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable feeling that everyone except them already knew how this story was about to change. Naomi walked forward with measured steps that echoed softly across the marble floor, and every pair of eyes followed her as though they were seeing her for the first time. The simple black service uniform had not changed. The neatly pressed apron had not changed. The polished shoes had not changed. Yet somehow everything about her looked different now. Respect had a strange way of changing what people thought they had already seen. Ethan Caldwell refused to let that feeling settle. Years of leading one of the largest technology companies in America had taught him that hesitation invited weakness, and weakness could cost billions. He forced another confident smile and folded his arms. "William, I believe there has been a misunderstanding," he said evenly. "Whoever she is still wearing a waitress uniform inside a restricted executive meeting." His words sounded logical, even persuasive. A few executives nodded, grateful that someone was restoring order. William Harrison remained silent. Instead, he turned his attention toward Naomi. "Would you please join us at the table?" he asked politely. The request landed harder than any announcement could have. It was not simply an invitation. It was recognition. Naomi nodded once before walking toward the empty chair positioned only a few seats away from the chairman himself. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Every movement reflected the quiet discipline of someone completely comfortable with where she belonged. Daniel Ross watched in disbelief. Margaret Sullivan lowered her reading glasses slightly, studying the reactions around the room instead of Naomi herself. She noticed executives exchanging uncertain looks, assistants outside the glass walls slowing their pace, and even Ethan struggling to hide the first genuine confusion anyone had seen on his face in years. Still, he refused to surrender control. "Before we continue this performance," Ethan said with a restrained laugh, "perhaps someone could explain why hospitality staff are suddenly participating in board meetings." No one answered immediately. The silence became heavier than the question itself. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the conference table and looked across at Ethan with calm, steady eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass him. She simply waited. She had learned long ago that truth never needed to compete with arrogance. It only needed time. William finally spoke. "Ethan, over the last 8 months, the board has conducted the most comprehensive leadership review in this company's history." Several executives blinked in surprise. None of them had known the review had continued for so long. "We examined financial performance, operational strategy, succession planning, and something far more difficult to measure," William continued. "Corporate culture." The final 2 words settled over the room like an unexpected storm cloud. Ethan straightened slightly. "Corporate culture?" he repeated. William nodded. "Yes, because balance sheets reveal what a company earns. Character reveals whether it deserves to keep earning it." Naomi remained perfectly still as every executive slowly realized that this meeting had never been about quarterly earnings. It had been about leadership all along, and whatever decision the board had already made was now only moments away from changing every career inside that room forever. The room remained perfectly still, yet the silence carried more pressure than the busiest trading floor on Wall Street. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, resting both palms on the polished conference table as though physical presence alone could restore the balance of power he had enjoyed for years. "Corporate culture does not determine who runs a company," he said with controlled confidence. "Results do." His words sounded familiar because everyone in the room had heard versions of that philosophy before. Quarterly growth, market expansion, shareholder value. Numbers had always been Ethan's strongest argument, and for years they had been enough. William Harrison listened patiently before folding his hands. "Results matter," he replied. "But leadership determines whether those results can last." Ethan gave a restrained smile. "With respect, I built this company from a regional startup into a global technology leader. We have offices in 22 states and clients around the world. I believe the numbers speak for themselves." Several executives nodded instinctively. Daniel Ross looked toward Margaret Sullivan, hoping she would support the familiar narrative, but she remained silent. Naomi Brooks continued sitting quietly beside the chairman, saying nothing, asking for nothing, showing no desire to interrupt. That silence began unsettling people far more than any speech could have. Ethan noticed it and turned toward her again. "Since everyone seems interested in this demonstration," he said, "perhaps someone should explain why a member of the hospitality staff has suddenly become the center of a board meeting." Naomi met his eyes calmly. "There will be an explanation." Her voice remained gentle, almost reassuring. "Just not for me." The answer only deepened the mystery. William reached toward the sealed folder, but deliberately stopped before opening it. Over the past 8 months, he said, the board authorized an independent leadership evaluation unlike anything this company has conducted before. Curious expressions spread across the room. Every executive presentation was reviewed. Every strategic recommendation was examined. Hundreds of employee interviews were completed. Anonymous surveys were collected from every department, from senior management to maintenance staff. Ethan frowned. I approved no such review. William nodded. You were not supposed to. Another wave of silence settled over the conference table. Outside the glass walls, assistants slowed their pace as they noticed the unusually tense atmosphere inside the executive suite. Even they sensed something historic was unfolding. William continued. Leadership cannot be measured only inside this room. It must also be measured in hallways, cafeterias, elevators, reception desks, and places where titles carry less weight than character. Ethan laughed quietly, but the confidence behind it had begun to fade. You interviewed employees? William answered without hesitation. We observed. We listened. We learned. Margaret finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Some of the most important conversations inside a company happen when executives believe no one important is listening. Ethan looked from Margaret to William, then toward Naomi, as scattered moments from the past several months flashed through his mind. Brief encounters with a quiet waitress serving coffee. Elevator rides where someone politely held the door. Executive dinners where hospitality staff moved almost invisibly through the room. Details he had never considered significant suddenly refused to leave his thoughts. Naomi remained composed, her hands resting neatly on the conference table. She did not celebrate his uncertainty. She simply watched as the certainty that had defined the billionaire for years began giving way to a single uncomfortable question. What if the person he had dismissed had been paying attention all along? William Harrison finally broke the silence by sliding the sealed folder to the center of the conference table. The sound of heavy paper against polished walnut seemed louder than anyone expected. Every executive watched the folder instead of the chairman, as though the answers inside carried the weight of the entire company. Ethan Caldwell remained standing. If this concerns succession planning, he said calmly, the board and I agreed that discussion would take place next quarter. William looked directly at him. That was the original schedule. He rested one hand on the folder before continuing. Circumstances changed. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What circumstances? William carefully opened the seal without rushing. No one reached for a laptop. No one checked a phone. Even the digital presentation screens along the walls had gone dark, leaving only the afternoon sunlight reflecting across the glass skyline behind them. The room had become something larger than a business meeting. It had become the place where reputations would be measured. William removed a single document bearing the company seal and placed it on the table. 3 nights ago, he said, the board concluded its final vote. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Daniel Ross quietly counted the faces around the room. Every voting director was present. Margaret Sullivan folded her hands, already knowing what would be read. Ethan took one slow breath. Final vote for what? William answered without hesitation. The future leadership of Caldwell Dynamics. The sentence settled over the room like winter air. Ethan forced a confident smile. Then I assume congratulations are in order for another unanimous vote of confidence. No one smiled back. William lowered his eyes to the document. The vote was unanimous. Ethan nodded once, relieved for the first time in several minutes. I appreciate the board's continued trust. William looked up again. You misunderstood the result. Every heartbeat inside the room seemed to slow. Daniel instinctively leaned forward. Margaret quietly removed her glasses. Naomi Brooks remained perfectly still, showing neither anticipation nor satisfaction. William began reading from the official resolution in a clear, measured voice. Effective immediately, the Board of Directors hereby concludes the executive transition process and appoints a new Chief Executive Officer to lead Caldwell Dynamics. Ethan's expression hardened. Executive transition? He interrupted. William continued reading without acknowledging the interruption. This appointment follows a comprehensive evaluation of strategic leadership, organizational culture, operational integrity, and long-term governance. The chairman paused briefly before reaching the final line. No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed silent. The board unanimously appoints Naomi Brooks as the next Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Dynamics, effective immediately. Absolute silence replaced every sound in the room. No laughter remained. No whispers survived. Daniel stared at Naomi as though he had forgotten how to blink. Several executives instinctively looked from the official document to the woman who only minutes earlier had been carrying a coffee tray. Ethan remained standing, unable to speak for the first time in his career. Naomi slowly met William's eyes before accepting the document he offered her with steady hands. She did not celebrate. She did not smile triumphantly. She simply accepted it with quiet dignity, while every person in the boardroom realized that the woman they had mistaken for background staff had already become the highest-ranking leader in the company before this meeting had even begun. For several long seconds, no one moved. The silence inside the executive boardroom was so complete that the distant hum of the city below became the only sound anyone could hear. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside his chair, staring at the official resolution as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. They did not. The company seal remained exactly where it was. William Harrison slowly closed the folder before looking around the room. The resolution has been approved according to our bylaws and is effective immediately. His calm voice carried the quiet certainty of a decision that could no longer be debated. Daniel Ross instinctively rose to his feet first, not because anyone instructed him to, but because decades of corporate leadership had taught him one simple rule: respect the office, regardless of who occupies it. Margaret Sullivan stood beside him without hesitation. One by one, the remaining board members followed. Chairs slid backward across the polished floor in a slow chorus that echoed through the room. Within moments, every voting director was standing. Only Ethan remained frozen beside his seat. Naomi Brooks looked around the room with composed humility. She neither celebrated nor appeared overwhelmed. Instead, she acknowledged each director with a respectful nod, understanding that the moment belonged to the company far more than it belonged to her. William extended his hand. "Congratulations, Chief Executive Officer Brooks." Naomi accepted the handshake with quiet confidence. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the trust the board has placed in me, and I intend to earn it every day." Her voice carried no triumph. It carried responsibility. Daniel stepped forward next. "Congratulations, Chief Executive Officer Brooks." Margaret followed with a warm smile. "Welcome to your new role." Soon every board member offered the same greeting. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Only minutes earlier, several of those same executives had mistaken Naomi for someone who belonged only along the walls of the room. Now they addressed her with the title reserved for the highest leader in the company. Ethan watched every handshake in stunned silence. The confidence that had filled his voice throughout the meeting had vanished, replaced by the unsettling realization that authority could change in a single afternoon. William finally turned toward him. His expression remained respectful. "Ethan, thank you for your years of service to Caldwell Dynamics. The board appreciates your contributions to building this company into an industry leader." Ethan swallowed before answering quietly. This was decided before today." William nodded once. "Months before today. Today's meeting was never intended to determine the outcome. It was intended to announce it." Ethan slowly looked toward Naomi. For the first time since she had entered the room, he truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the coffee tray she had carried earlier, not the assumptions he had made. He saw the woman every director already recognized as the future of the company. Naomi met his eyes with calm professionalism. There was no resentment in her expression, only quiet respect. She understood that leadership was never proven by humiliating someone who had lost power. Real leadership began in moments exactly like this, when dignity mattered more than victory, and everyone in that room suddenly understood that the company had not simply chosen a new chief executive officer. It had chosen a different definition of leadership itself. The room gradually settled into a quieter rhythm, but nothing inside Caldwell Dynamics would ever feel quite the same again. William Harrison invited Naomi Brooks to the chair at the head of the conference table, the seat that for years had symbolized unquestioned authority. She paused before taking it, looking instead at the executives gathered around her. "Before anything else," she said softly, "I want to thank every employee in this company who believed their work mattered. even when they thought no one was paying attention. Her words surprised the room. No grand promises. No celebration. Just gratitude. She took her seat with the same calm dignity she had carried while wearing a service apron only an hour earlier. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside his former chair, still processing the speed with which the world around him had changed. William turned toward the executives. There is one additional matter the board believes everyone should understand. He nodded toward Naomi. The floor is yours. Naomi folded her hands on the table before speaking. Many of you are probably wondering why I spent months working in the hospitality department instead of introducing myself as the incoming chief executive officer. Curious expressions spread across the room. Daniel Ross leaned forward. Margaret Sullivan smiled quietly, already knowing the answer. The board never asked me to hide from the company, Naomi continued. They asked me to understand it. She explained that before accepting the position, she had proposed a simple condition. She wanted to experience the organization from the perspective of the people who welcomed guests, cleaned conference rooms, prepared meals, answered reception phones, and worked long hours without appearing in quarterly reports. She believed that if she could not understand the everyday culture of the company, she had no business leading it. William nodded with quiet approval. The board unanimously supported that request. Naomi continued. For 8 months, I worked alongside employees who rarely appeared in executive presentations. I listened instead of announcing who I was. I observed instead of judging. I learned where people felt respected and where they felt invisible. She glanced around the room before adding, titles open office doors. Character opens people's trust. The sentence lingered in the silence. Ethan lowered his eyes as scattered memories returned with startling clarity. He remembered the polite waitress who always greeted employees by name. The woman who held elevators for interns while senior executives hurried past without noticing. The quiet staff member who thanked custodians after late evening meetings. Those moments had seemed insignificant. Now they formed a picture he had completely missed. Daniel finally spoke. Every conversation, every interaction, you were learning about us. Naomi nodded gently. Not about performance. About culture. Numbers tell you how a company is doing today. People tell you whether it will still be successful 10 years from now. No one argued. No one laughed. The executives realized that the greatest evaluation in company history had never been hidden inside financial statements or confidential reports. It had been taking place in ordinary hallways, elevators, cafeterias, and conference rooms where everyday choices quietly revealed the true character of the people trusted to lead. And in that realization, everyone understood that the board had not chosen Naomi because she had disguised herself as a waitress. They had chosen her because she had been willing to see what every other executive had overlooked. The meeting ended, but no one rushed toward the elevators the way they normally did after quarterly board sessions. Executives who usually hurried to their next appointment remained quietly seated, reflecting on a lesson that no financial report had ever been able to teach. Through the towering windows, the evening sun settled behind the Chicago skyline, casting long golden reflections across the conference table where one chapter of the company had quietly ended and another had just begun. Naomi Brooks stood before the room one final time before leaving for her new office. She looked at the familiar faces around her, from directors to senior executives, and then toward the assistants waiting outside the glass doors. Before we move forward, she said gently, there is one promise I want every employee in this company to hear. The room became silent once again. No one at Caldwell Dynamics will ever be considered unimportant because of a job title. Every person who walks through these doors deserves the same respect, whether they are presenting a billion-dollar strategy or serving a cup of coffee. Her words carried through the room without force, yet they reached every person listening. William Harrison smiled quietly. Margaret Sullivan nodded with unmistakable pride. Daniel Ross looked toward the hallway where reception staff, maintenance employees, and hospitality workers continued their normal routines, unaware that they had just become part of the company's future vision. Ethan Caldwell slowly stepped forward. The confidence that had once defined every movement had been replaced by something far more difficult to earn: perspective. He looked directly at Naomi before speaking. I spent years believing leadership was measured by how many people followed my decisions. He paused briefly. Today I learned it is measured by how many people feel seen because of them. Naomi listened without interrupting. There was no satisfaction in proving someone wrong. Only appreciation that someone had chosen to grow instead of becoming defensive. She extended her hand. Ethan accepted it. The handshake lasted only a moment, but everyone understood its meaning. It was not about victory or defeat. It was about choosing respect over pride. As employees gradually gathered outside the boardroom after hearing whispers of the announcement, they watched something few had ever witnessed. The newest chief executive officer paused to thank the receptionist by name before greeting the facilities manager, complimenting the catering team, and asking in turn how her first week had been. None of it was staged. None of it was performed for applause. That was simply who Naomi had been long before anyone knew her title. Weeks later, employees would say the atmosphere inside Caldwell Dynamics felt different. Meetings became more collaborative. New ideas came from people who had once been afraid to speak. Departments that rarely interacted began working together with renewed trust. The numbers eventually improved, but by then everyone understood they were only the result of something much deeper. Companies grow because people do. Buildings impress visitors because of their architecture. Organizations inspire people because of their character. And sometimes the greatest leader is not the loudest voice in the room or the person sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes the greatest leader is the one who first learns how every person feels while standing beside the wall, carrying a simple tray, quietly reminding the world that respect should never depend on a title, because real leadership begins long before anyone calls you Chief Executive Officer.